Hello, and welcome to Old Testament Storytime with Amanda. I'm sorry, it's a working title. I don't have good ideas. But yeah, this is a podcast. I've been wanting to do this for a while. And this is just going to be me telling stories from the Old Testament. I feel like a lot of people don't know a lot of stories from the Old Testament, and I think that I can tell them in a maybe funny, interesting, entertaining, informative sort of way, and specifically from a perspective of a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So my goals, I have a couple goals with this podcast. First, I want to help people better understand the Old Testament. It's something that I think a lot of people want to know better, but it just looks so big and intimidating, and sometimes the language is confusing and the culture is so far removed from us it doesn't make sense. So I want to help people just like maybe understand the stories a little better, at least get to know the stories, and also help people to find Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is a book of scripture. It does testify of Jesus Christ, and so I want to highlight that as I go through these stories. And I do have one caveat. I can only guarantee 10 episodes because I'm doing this as an assignment for one of my classes. So I have to do 10 episodes. But I hope to do more. I hope to continue this. I hope to do as many as I can. I'll try to do this maybe about once a week. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah, so this episode is going to be an introduction to the Old Testament, because many people profess a belief in the Bible, including us as Latter-day Saints or members of the Church of Jesus Christ. But even if they've read it or read parts of it, they may not really know much about it, like where it is, where it comes from. So I'm going to kind of tell a little bit of background. The Old Testament is a collection of a bunch of distinct books from a variety of authors. We know who some of the authors are. We don't know who some of the other ones are. Some of them it's unsure. But there are a few different versions of the Old Testament. So there's the Hebrew Bible, which is the Bible that the Jewish religion uses. There's also the Catholic Bible and the Protestant Bible. There's a bunch of different versions with different like versions of Christianity. And the main difference is like some of them include more books than the others. For example, the Catholic Bible includes some books, a section of books that some people call the Apocrypha, if you've ever heard that before. It's just some books that are found, they originate from what's called the Septuagint. I'll talk about that in a second. But in the Protestant Bible, we have just a few fewer books. And so, yeah. Anyway, there are three main sources that we have for like original Bible manuscripts. The Septuagint, which is what I mentioned before, was the oldest one that we had for a really long time, but it wasn't in the original Hebrew language. It was actually a Greek translation. It was from around like 200 BC to 100 AD, kind of like right around Christ's time. It was translated over many years, but it was the oldest one that we had for a long time, but it wasn't like the purest original. So we also had the Masoretic text, which was in the original Hebrew language, but it was much newer because it was copied in about the 7th to 10th centuries AD. So we didn't have anything that was super, super old, especially in the Hebrew language, until about the 1940s and 50s, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are super, super interesting. I highly recommend like looking up. Another thing I forgot to mention is that I'm going to include sources with each of these. So looking at my sources, you can read a little bit more about them. There are so many like documentaries and books about them, but basically they were discovered about 80 years ago. They were written in the original Hebrew language, although fewer in Aramaic, but they date back to around the same time as the Septuagint, around Christ's time. But they include parts of original, old, very old manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, as well as a bunch of other documents and pieces of writing that give us a lot of insight into like Hebrew language and culture. Super cool. So those were really important when they were discovered. Anyway, we have, I'm going to go back to Old Testament. The books in the Old Testament can be grouped into a few categories, depending on who you ask, but the Hebrew Bible is typically described in three groups. The first is the Torah, which consists of the first 5 books of the Bible, which were believed to have been written by Moses. So if you ever hear people talk about the books of Moses, that's the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. The second category is the prophets, which is the words of ancient Jewish prophets. And the third category is the writings, which include sort of like anonymous like writings of wisdom, like Proverbs and Psalms and all those. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of the Old Testament. It goes from the creation of the earth to not too long before Christ's time. And yeah, I am excited to get through all of that. I do have a couple tips for studying the Old Testament. First is to read other translations of the Bible. And I know as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it almost feels like a sin. It feels sort of taboo to talk about like other Bible translations. I don't really know why. I think it's sort of cultural. But the King James Bible is so awesome, but it's written at a really high reading level, which is cool. If that's your thing, great, love it. But sometimes it's hard to understand, even for me. There's so many words I'm like, I have no idea what that means. So there are lots of other Bible translations, including like the New International Version is really good. There are lots of apps you can download. I'll put some stuff in the sources, but highly recommend that. My other tip is that we don't know exactly like how or where some of the stories from the Old Testament originated. A lot of them were probably passed down orally for generations before they were ever written down. And we don't really know like exactly how much of it is literal or metaphorical. Some of it might be like poetry even, like a lot of it is poetry. So I would suggest like not to get too caught up in what's literal and what's metaphorical. I don't think that the main purpose of the Old Testament, I don't think is necessarily to give us a literal or exact history, but rather the main purpose is to testify of how involved God has been in the lives of his children through all times of the earth, and also to testify of Jesus Christ. So yeah, my suggestion would be to just focus on what you can learn about God and about Jesus Christ from the stories. Some of them may not have too much you can learn from them. Some of them are a little weird, a little crazy, and yeah, so buckle up for that. But yeah, anyway, for that reason, because I want to focus on what we can learn about Jesus Christ, at the end of each podcast episode, I'm going to suggest like a lesson or something that we can learn from Christ, about Christ from the story. But I also hope that you ponder and make your own connections. If you are studying the Old Testament along with this, or if you just go back and read some of the chapters, or even if you're just thinking about the stories, I highly invite you to try and make your own connections. And also to relate it to your own personal experiences. So for this episode, I wanted to say that we can see Christ so much through like just the fact that we have the Bible. I think a lot of members of the Church of Jesus Christ kind of judge the Old Testament a little too harshly. Sometimes we'll be quick to ascribe things to translation error or whatever, but I think we sometimes don't realize how amazing and miraculous it is that we have the Old Testament the way we have it now. Like these texts, these stories and traditions are so ancient, and they were carried by kind of a small nation of people that has been scattered and torn apart countless times throughout history. So the fact that we have this stuff is kind of insane, and I think that really shows us how much the scriptures matter to Christ. He quoted from them often during his ministry and also testified of their importance, and also really shows how much he loves us to have like preserved those things to a point that it's so widely available and that we have them literally in at the tips of our fingertips. So at the tips of our fingertips. Oh my gosh, the tips of our fingers. So anyway, I hope that you enjoy this. I hope that it's something you can learn from and something that you look forward to. And if you have any suggestions or tips or feedback, please let me know. But yeah, see you next time.